Dr. Gillian Einstein is working on a mystery.
I often said if I couldn't make it in science, I wanted to be a detective.
Luckily for her, she did make it in science, and in a big way.
I'm a professor of psychology at the University of Toronto. I'm also the Wilfred and Joyce Poslin's Chair in Women's Brain Health and Aging, and Sex and Gender Hub Lead for the Canadian Consortium on Neurodegeneration and Aging.
Gillian Einstein studies women's brain health, and she found her way to the brain by studying something else entirely.
I started in science anyway, studying the visual system. So my PhD was actually in vision, and my first grant was actually on vision. But as I was doing the work on my first grant, I realized the area that I was studying was an area that's affected in Alzheimer's disease. The place where I was at the time, which was Duke University, had a really thriving Alzheimer's disease group, so thriving that they had even started collecting human brains at autopsy for studying changes in the brain. That was actually when I realized most of the brains that I was seeing at autopsy were women's brains.
The mystery she's working on is a big one. Why does Alzheimer's affect more women than men? 2/3 of all the people who have Alzheimer's are women, and we don't really know why.
I think it's a huge injustice that women are not being studied more in this disease. I think the reason that female animals are not being used in the animal models to develop drugs is another really important reason that we don't understand what therapeutics are going to be useful in Alzheimer's disease and which therapeutics are not going to be useful in Alzheimer's disease. So you're calling this a mystery actually gets right to the spirit of my approach and what I'm trying to do. I don't like to see injustice. And also, it's interesting. I like going places that nobody else has gone.
This is Overlooked, and I'm Golda Arthur. This episode is all about injustice and that one mystery: why more women than men get Alzheimer's disease. And I know we all tend to think of Alzheimer's as something that affects older people, but Gillian Einstein's research focuses on women in their 30s. What she's discovering could change how you think about your 30s, your 40s, and maybe even the choices you're making right now. Because the seeds of Alzheimer's might be planted decades before symptoms appear. But that also means there's time to intervene. In our conversation, she'll explain what life experiences put women at risk, why current treatments barely work for us, and what you can actually do to protect your brain. All that is coming up after the break. Hey, welcome to Overlooked, a podcast with a point of view that women's health cannot wait. If you want more of that point of view and the backstory to this episode, sign up for my newsletter at overlookedpod.com. That's overlookedpod.com. Gillian, welcome to Overlooked, and thank you so much for making the time to talk to me. You're kind of a big deal, so I'm very excited to be talking to you. What do you think is the most overlooked aspect of Alzheimer's in women?
I think the most overlooked aspect is what are the early life experiences that shift the balance of brain aging towards Alzheimer's disease. When we say that 2/3 of the people with Alzheimer's disease are women, a lot of people come back and say, well, yeah, isn't that just because they live longer? There is truth to that. We live longer. Age is the biggest risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. But we also get to Alzheimer's disease differently than, I'll say, XY people, meaning males. We get to it later in life. We get to it by the time it's diagnosed with more brain pathology. There are potentially different life experiences that can change the trajectory. And so I guess I'm kind of on a quest to study what I think is this very overlooked area, which is these earlier life experiences that sort of set the trajectory. I've landed on trying to understand how early life experiences that alter estrogen levels might be a biological something that could set the stage for a long progress of really synaptic or disconnection between neurons, which is really how I see Alzheimer's disease, that it's a disconnection syndrome.
Give me an example of what you're thinking about when you talk about these early experiences in our lives that kind of set the stage for Alzheimer's later in life.
Well, if we're thinking directly about estrogens and hormone levels, we could think of many things that happen to women before they would ever go through what you would think of as natural menopause, or what the literature calls spontaneous menopause. They might have their ovaries removed at the age of 30. They may have a greater burden of caregiving, which through stress hormones could also affect the whole steroid hormone axis in the body. They might have early life adverse experiences like sexual abuse that could affect long-term issues like depression, which is also a risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. They might have polycystic ovarian syndrome. They might have cancer therapies that maybe they affect the brain directly, but maybe they actually affect the ovaries. So the ovaries stop secreting 17 beta estradiol.
17 beta estradiol is a primary estrogen hormone made by the ovaries. It's what we're really talking about when we say estrogen.
So these are areas that if I had a lifetime, I would look into, but I don't. So I'm focusing on early life hormonal losses.
And when you say early, are you talking about the 20s, the 30s?
Well, what I'm studying usually happens in the 30s and early 40s. But when I talk about adverse childhood experiences, that happens when kids are 5, 6, 7. It just happens that I'm studying a bit later. I was really struck by a study many, many years ago. Probably it could be 30 years old now, called the Rush Nun Study. The Rush is a hospital in Chicago.
The Nun study of aging and Alzheimer's disease started in 1986, and it was a longitudinal study, meaning that it collected data on a group of nuns over a period of many years. It focused on a group of almost 700 American Roman Catholic nuns, who, in addition to giving consent to having their brains studied, also allowed researchers to look at their early writings.
They had this great idea to look at the early writings of novitiates, people who wanted to be nuns, what they wrote about why they wanted to be nuns when they were 18 and 19, and then study them later in life. They found them when they were older, and they actually got their brains at autopsy. And they loved this population. I can tell you the funniest explanation of this population is that, well, they all had the same standard of living, they all had the same level of education, and they were all married to the same man.
Researchers studied those writings for something called cognitive reserve. How many ideas are expressed? How complex is the language, the sentence structure, the use of grammar?
So this study found that the novitiates who at the age of 18, when they studied the writing was a lot thinner with much less description, much less rich construction of language of the people who in later life got Alzheimer's disease. And those same people had more of the hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease, plaques and tangles, than the novitiates who wrote more complicated and rich descriptions of why they wanted to be nuns.
Plaques and tangles. These are protein deposits that accumulate in the brain and interfere with how brain cells communicate with each other.
This made me think, oh my gosh, Alzheimer's disease could start as soon as the brain stops developing, early as the age of 18.
That's a little chilling to hear you say that, actually.
Well, it's chilling, but I think it's also hopeful because it means there's a long period in which all the kinds of good interventions like diet and exercise and things that are heart healthy, getting good sleep, and even hormone therapy, they could potentially really help. Because those women with the thinner language capabilities, They might not have gone on to get Alzheimer's disease if something else hadn't happened, right? It's not just one thing happens and then you have it or you're born with it. It's a series of life events and exposures.
You were talking about studying the 30s as a decade, women in their 30s. My 30s, it was just a dumpster fire decade. I had I had my babies at 30. I had two. And it was just not a good decade for me. And of course, the 40s were great because the 30s were so sour. But when you think about all the things that can happen to a woman, the kind of chronic stress that we are exposed to just on the regular, but objectively speaking, I read this term, this idea of like a gendered environment affects human biology. And that's such a beautiful line because it speaks to sort of the power of what's been understudied in women. So for listeners who are listening to this and thinking, yes, my 30s were also a dumpster fire. Am I going to get Alzheimer's? Contextualize this a little bit for me and say more about what you found so far and how much is too much in a way.
Right. Well, dumpster fires are interesting because they end, the fire gets put out, and the body is incredibly resilient. You think of people who smoked, for 40 years and then they give up smoking, their lungs get better. They're not perfect, but they get a lot better. We really are regenerative creatures, which is something kind of amazing about the human body. So a decade, even though it's really horrible at the time, one might recover from it. What I guess concerns me is just long term, consistent changes. So while we don't study women younger than 35, and most of the women in our study are, average age 42, 43. So we're not studying people that young, but they've gotten to where they are in our focus because they've had both ovaries removed, and some of them have had estradiol or estrogen given back to them, and some of them haven't. So what we see in that group is that while estradiol is not a silver bullet, it doesn't change everything. The decrements in the kind of memory that helps you find your car where you parked it on a given day, or the kind of memory that helps you remember lists of things, what you wanted to get at the grocery store, a story that you heard that you want to retell, those two kinds of memory, they go down in the women who are not given estradiol. But at least the memory for finding where your keys are, finding where your car is, that, at least in our population, seems to get better if they're taking hormone replacement or hormone therapy. We see these decrements compared to women who are the same age, who have their ovaries, but they're not outside the range of normal yet. On the other hand, the women in our study, when we interview them, they talk about exactly these kinds of memory problems. If we ask them, are you having problems with their memory? And they say, yes, this is exactly what they described to us. So it's noticeable to them. And that's actually called subjective cognitive decline. It's, an area of Alzheimer's disease research that Alzheimer's is trying to stage the disease earlier and earlier, because we all know, we're all convinced now that by the time somebody has Alzheimer's disease, it's too late to intervene. There's not a substrate of neurons to really help. So we're looking at earlier and earlier periods. The women we study have subjective cognitive decline, and that affects the quality of their life. So I guess we were talking about, can you reverse any of this stuff? If you have that dumpster fire, yes, some interventions can help reverse. Maybe not everything, but a lot.
I want to say, like, all of this hits very close to home for me. I had my ovaries removed at 48 as a preventative measure for ovarian cancer. So I definitely have some skin in the game as I hear you talk about all of this. I think I'd written about the connection between surgical menopause and Alzheimer's very tangentially before I had my own surgery. But after my surgery, I remember the folks at the hospital gave me 3 PDFs, which they emailed to me, just of like things to watch out for. And one of them was bone health, the second was cardiovascular health, and the third was Alzheimer's. And I was so stunned to look at that. I thought, yeah, yes, heart health is huge, bone health, absolutely, but Alzheimer's. So it's really fascinating to hear you talk about this idea of kind of going earlier and earlier to try and understand Alzheimer's in women, and obviously with the view to protect women from Alzheimer's at some point. It's fascinating to hear that.
The women who are having the steepest cognitive decline are women who have their ovaries removed, 35, 38 and earlier. So you're pretty close to spontaneous menopause in that sense, and it gets a little less drastic. And of course, not everybody will get Alzheimer's disease. So the pamphlet that you were handed, the warning about Alzheimer's disease, is based on large epidemiological studies in which, they've been looking at the risk of late life Alzheimer's disease based on whether people had their ovaries removed prior to the age of, in this case, probably 50, but it's really gotten narrowed down now to about earlier than 48. It used to drive me crazy when I would ask my father a question and he would say, it depends on the person. But it really does. So there's no guarantee you're going to get Alzheimer's disease. And I'm quite surprised they put that in there because it's very unusual for, standard surgical procedures to have that kind of insight
Yeah.
into what's in the scientific literature. But, the underlying theme of that bone health, heart health, and brain health, that's all estradiol. The loss of that happens with removal of the ovaries takes away a really important modulator of health of all three of those body systems. The women who can take hormone therapy, it's been shown to be very helpful in this group.
Why have we spent so much time and money and effort studying the female reproductive system over almost every other organ in the female body? And I mean, is that true, firstly?
Well, I don't know about the money spent, but certainly the success of that study has been great. So I would ask that question myself. I think that's a really interesting question. But I also want to say, if we hadn't done that, I probably would have died in childbirth. In developed countries where there's good medical care and people have access to it, we've got this childbirth thing down pretty much.
Mm-hmm.
And it's because there was a lot of focus there. Now, why was the focus there? I can only think that it's the male gaze. So many of the people doing the research were males. What did they think was important about women? The reproductive system. When it comes to cancer, what do they focus on? They focus on breast cancer. In women, they don't focus on gastrointestinal cancers, pancreatic cancers. So I do think in a simple way, it's the male gaze. There's a great story about the guy looking under the lamppost for his keys. And when asked, did you lose your keys here? And he says, no. And then, why are you looking there? It's because that's where the light is.
Right.
Yeah, you can see it. You can see the breasts. You can see a baby being born. Women are incredibly mysterious in many cultures that we can produce a new life. Men can't do that.
Right. So you take that forward, the ovaries seem to be like this sort of most mysterious thing of all, buried all the way deep within us in that sense. And I think probably have suffered a great deal from not being in the lamppost, right? Not being in the light.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think that's why so many cases of ovarian cancer are fatal because we haven't put money into figuring out how to bring the ovaries. The pancreas, there's the same problem. Gastric cancer, same problem. Bring it into the light where we can actually observe these over time and figure out when is the tissue not healthy anymore? When do we need to make a move on it? There are many things that we don't pay attention to because we can't see them. But there are
Yeah.
also things we don't pay attention to because they're not of immediate relevance to us. And I think there's a lot about women's health that's that way.
What has been your biggest surprise in the work that you do?
Wow. I hadn't thought about that question. I think what surprises me is that people still don't understand the importance of studying sex and gender. People still don't understand that having an X chromosome and a Y chromosome might set up a different scaffolding
Mm.
for health than having two X chromosomes. I've spent a lot of my professional life through my roles like my role at the CCNA with the Sex and Gender Hub, explaining to people about their research where studying sex differences or thinking about gender might actually lead them to some really interesting discoveries. I have to convince people of this. And I find that really surprising. It's still, for many people, a black box, an unimportant black box. I think it's because scientists really want to show something that's generalizable. And if you say you found something about one group, but not the other group, that's not generalizable anymore. But really, in biology, variation is the key to the realm. I mean, if you look for stability in biology, I think you're barking up the wrong tree. So I tell people who say, why do we have to study women? Why is this being mandated now that we have to include both sexes in our grant proposals? Blah, blah, we won't get funded, blah, blah, blah. And I say, well, I look at it this way. People aren't studying women because they have this excuse that it's too complicated. Women have menstrual cycles. Women are childbearing. Things change toward the end of life for us. It's just complicated. But I say, if we had been studying women all along and they said to us that we had to study men now, we would say, but men are too simple. It's not a good representation of biology.
So, Gillian, talk to me about Alzheimer's treatments. I've been reading that the treatments that are being developed seem to be more effective in men than in women. Is that the case? And how are we doing with Alzheimer's treatments for women?
Well, that's a great question. There really aren't any treatments that are being developed for women specifically. Most of the new treatments are antibody treatments against A beta, a protein that seems to accumulate in the brains of people with Alzheimer's disease. And most of the treatments are developed in male animal models. So, right from the get go, there's an issue about whether this treatment is going to work in female humans or not. And then the clinical trials are conducted now with human females in the trial, usually trying to get about 50-50, but it's powered for the whole sample. That means in order to get a legitimate answer of a result, it means that they have to use both the men and the women together. And when they do that, in order to not confound the analysis with any possible sex differences, they control for sex. So while women are in this trial, sex is controlled for. So we don't really know how women might respond differently to the treatment than men. Now, some of these studies take an approach where they do a sub-study. It's not powered for strong results from the sub-study, but nevertheless, a few of them have done sub-studies where they have taken the data in males and compared it to the data in females. And there, they have found that the treatments are not as effective in females as in males. And since they're not terribly effective in males to begin with, that means they're pretty close to ineffective in females, which is not to say that there might not be some females or some women for whom this treatment might work. There's always a mean and a standard deviation. But in the mean, in the sub-studies looking at sex differences, they don't really work. So you have to ask yourself, who are they developing these drugs for when 2/3 of the people with Alzheimer's disease are women?
When people ask you, what should I do to not get Alzheimer's? What do you say to them?
Well, I say, do everything that's good for your heart.
Mhm.
Exercise, eat well, Try not to be too overweight. Keep our social network strong. Everything that's good for your heart is good for your brain. And we know a lot about heart health, a little bit less about brain health, but we actually do know that exercise tends to benefit the cognition of women more than it benefits the cognition of men.
Well, thank you again for joining me on Overlooked, and I'm so glad that you're doing what you're doing.
Thank you for asking me, and thank you for doing this, because it's a huge service. It's really important that everybody learn more about women's health.
Overlooked is here for information and empowerment, but not medical advice. Every person's body is unique, so if you have questions, it is best to speak to your doctor or healthcare provider. We're building a community around women's health so that no one is overlooked. If you'd like to be part of it, hit the follow button on this podcast, wherever you're listening to this. Or you can show us some love by writing us a review and sharing this episode with someone. Overlooked is written and created by me, Golda Arthur. Jessica Martinez de Hoz is the show's producer. You can stay up to date with the show by signing up for the newsletter and following us on Instagram and LinkedIn. We read every review and email, so write to us, hello@overlookedpod.com. Thanks for listening.